Recently, 6,000 A320 aircraft, more than half of the global fleet, have been ordered to be grounded. Let's get into the details. 1. Main event, entire A320 fleet grounded. 2. When the world had to hit the pause button on the A320, no sirens. No single dramatic moment to point a finger at. Just a series of fragmented technical signals, appearing in different places at different times, but all pointing in the same direction. And then, the aviation industry did what it must always do when uncertain. Stop. In decades of watching planes take off and land, I know one thing very clearly. When a wildly popular aircraft line like the Airbus A320 is ordered to pause operations on a broad scale, it is never a decision taken lightly. The A320 is not a rare model. It is the backbone of short and medium-haul aviation globally. Every day, it quietly connects cities on time, consistently, almost invisibly. That is precisely why, when the brakes are pulled on it, the entire system immediately wobbles. This decision did not come from a single country or a single airline. It was the result of regulators and manufacturers looking at the same data picture and reaching a conclusion no one wanted. Something was not right, and no one could be sure where the consequences would end. In aviation, when the answer is unclear, flying on is not an option. To the public, a mass grounding sounds extreme, but to industry veterans, this is a familiar reflex. Modern aircraft operate based on layers of overlapping systems. When one small link begins to behave abnormally, it is no longer a matter of a single plane, but of an entire design lineage. This event reiterates a cold reality. Aviation is safe not because there are no risks, but because whenever a risk appears, the entire industry is ready to stop, scrutinize every detail, before allowing the wheels to roll onto the runway again. Cause: software/flight control error. After the fleet was pulled back to Earth, the real question was not what happened, but where did it start? And the answer this time did not lie in metal, bolts, or flaps. It lay deeper, within the invisible lines of code controlling how the aircraft reacts to the outside world. The A320 is a product of the digital aviation era. Pilots no longer directly push and pull control surfaces in a purely mechanical sense. They send requests. The flight control system receives, calculates, and then decides how to execute that request within pre-programmed limits. Most of the time, this mechanism works smoothly, precisely, and incredibly efficiently. But the problem began when data entering the system was no longer being interpreted correctly. In certain specific flight situations, uncommon but distinct enough to draw attention, the software showed signs of processing data differently than expected. Not a complete failure. Not a loss of control, but small, offbeat reactions like a musician hearing the wrong drumbeat in a large band. If the pilot requested a reaction, the system still complied, but the way it understood that request might not align perfectly. To outsiders, this sounds theoretical, but to engineers and investigators, it is a red flag. In aviation, the difference between nearly right and absolutely right is not a minor detail. It is the boundary of safety. That is why the decision to ground the planes was not to wait for an accident to confirm the fear. It was to prevent that from happening. When software, the brain of the aircraft, starts giving inconsistent answers, the aviation industry does not argue, and it does not gamble. They shut it down, open the source code, and check every line until they are certain that when a pilot says one thing, the plane will not understand it as something else. 3. Triggering event. After scattered technical warnings and data that didn't quite match, it wasn't until a specific flight encountered an incident mid-journey that the picture truly became clear. It was not an accident in the traditional sense. The plane remained under control. But what happened was powerful enough to force the entire industry to look the problem in the eye. During that flight, the A320 was operating in a stable flight phase when its altitude changed abruptly, breaking the familiar rhythm. Not a long dive, nor ordinary turbulence. It was like someone unexpectedly adjusted the altitude when everything was running smoothly. The result was injuries to some on board, and the crew had no choice but to bring the plane down earlier than planned. The important thing was not that the flight landed safely. The aviation industry looks not just at the outcome, but at the entire chain of events leading up to it. Data logs showed the system had reacted in a way the pilots did not actively request. Not a random reaction, but a logical one, only that logic was not in the expected script. This very moment turned technical doubts into an issue that could not be ignored. When a system designed to protect starts interpreting situations in its own way, the line between assistance and interference becomes blurred. And in aviation, a blurred line is the most dangerous thing. That incident did not stand alone. It became the fulcrum for investigators to connect previous signs, piecing them into an ordered sequence. From here, the story was no longer "is there a problem?" but "where else does that problem exist?" And that is why the investigation was expanded, rigorous, and uncompromising, because once a system has spoken in a different voice, no one dares pretend they didn't hear it. 4. Actions by Airbus and aviation safety authorities. After the mid-air incident forced the industry to face reality, all eyes turned to two familiar focal points: the manufacturer and the supervising agencies. In aviation, this is a time with no room for public debate or ambiguous statements. When the data speaks clearly enough, action must follow, and it must happen in unison. Airbus was not alone in this story. As soon as the technical signs were confirmed, the company immediately worked directly with the world's largest aviation safety agencies. SA in Europe and the FAA in the US are not names that appear just to sign papers. They dug deep into every data packet, every flight record, every line of code related to the flight control system. The goal was simple: determine exactly where the plane misheard and why that could happen. The decision issued was not punitive, nor was it a panicked reaction. It was a technical order, dry but decisive. The aircraft is only allowed back in the sky after the software is checked, calibrated, and proven to respond correctly in every relevant scenario. No exceptions by airline, region, or schedule pressure. To outsiders, this might look like slamming on the emergency brakes. But to me, after over 30 years following investigations, this is how the system protects itself. When the hardware is silent but the software starts speaking off-key, the solution is not a quick patch, but to stop, dismantle the internal logic structure, and reassemble it correctly. The most critical point lies here. No one sought to assign blame immediately. Airbus focused on fixing. The agencies focused on controlling. And only when both nodded in agreement were the wheels allowed to roll onto the runway. In modern aviation, trust does not come from promises. It comes from lines of code verified to the point where there is no room for misinterpretation. 5. Scale of impact. When the technical order was issued, the true scale of the problem was revealed. This was no longer the story of one flight or a single group of aircraft. More than 6,000 A320s, spanning every continent, were simultaneously asked to pause operations to await the same thing: a software update and re-verification. To the aviation industry, that number is like removing more than half the pieces from the chessboard in a single move. The A320 is not a fringe aircraft. It is a pillar. Airlines use it to keep the daily rhythm, from the busiest routes to seemingly ordinary ones. When a massive number of planes are frozen at once, flight schedules are not just disrupted, they have to be rewritten from scratch. There are no quick fixes, no replacement options large enough. The key is no airline was exempt. Whether flying in the US, Europe, or Asia, if the software configuration fell into the group needing inspection, the plane was forced to stay on the ground. This decision cut across all commercial boundaries. In that moment, everyone played by the same rules. To veterans, this is an inevitable consequence of how modern aviation operates. When a design is replicated globally, every problem, no matter how small, is multiplied by a massive factor. The advantage of standardization comes with the risk of contagion. A tweak in the flight control system is no longer an internal matter for the manufacturer. It directly impacts the transport flow of the entire world. This event shows why the aviation industry always reacts in a seemingly rigid way. Not because they are certain something terrible is about to happen, but because they understand very clearly. When the scale is this large, there is no room for assumptions. Only when every A320 speaks the same language will the sky be reopened. Impact on passengers and airlines. when the system starts paying the price off the runway. When more than half the A320 fleet was held on the ground, the impact did not stop at technical rooms or management meeting tables. It spread straight outside, where flight schedules operate like a giant clock. And this time, that clock began to lose its rhythm. Airlines did not have many choices. The A320 is their backbone. When a huge number of aircraft cannot take off, plans built months in advance are forced to change in a very short time. Some flights were rescheduled. Some disappeared from the electronic boards. Not because of a lack of crew, not because of weather, but because the aircraft considered most ready was now not allowed to roll. Jetstar, American Airlines, EasyJet, Avianca, familiar names in global schedules, all had to announce adjustments. This did not reflect an individual problem of any single airline. It demonstrated the industry's deep dependence on a single aircraft line. When the pillar shakes slightly, the entire structure above is forced to lean with it. For airlines, this is a problem with no pretty solution. Leasing replacement aircraft is not easy. Shifting fleets from elsewhere only patches a tiny fraction. Every decision carries a cost, and that cost is not just counted in money. It is also reputation, the reliability of a transport system built on the concept of being on time. But in the aviation industry, no one views this disruption as a reason to ignore risk. Those who have lived long enough with investigations understand that the price of flying when uncertain is always far higher than the price of stopping and enduring temporary pressure. When the flight schedule is bent, it is not a sign of chaos. It is a sign that the system is self-correcting, accepting immediate difficulty to avoid a greater cost later. 7. Safety is the top priority. Looking back at the entire chain of events, from the initial technical signs, the mid-journey incident, to more than half the fleet being held on the ground, there is one consistent principle that has never changed. In aviation, safety is not a slogan, it is a way of decision-making. And sometimes, the safest decision is not to fly. Mass grounding the A320 to update software was not a reaction to a disaster that had already happened. It was a preventive action, triggered at the right time, before small pieces could assemble into an uncontrollable picture. In this industry, people do not wait until the system fails completely to act. Just seeing it start to speak in a different voice is a strong enough reason to stop. I have witnessed many similar moments in over 30 years in the profession. Each time, the public often asks why it has to be so strict. The answer is always the same. Because once the plane has left the ground, there is no room for debate. Every deviation, no matter how small, must be handled beforehand. In this case, the software update was not just patching a bug. It was a process of bringing the entire system back to a common standard, ensuring that when humans issue a command, the machine will understand correctly, act correctly, and not interpret it on its own. That is the foundation of trust, the thing that keeps millions of flights every year occurring in silence. The A320 event reminds us of an important thing. Aviation is safe not because there are no glitches, but because whenever a glitch appears, the entire industry is ready to accept interruption, endure pressure, and pay a short-term price to keep a long-term promise. The sky only reopens when every question has a clear answer, and that is exactly why, no matter how complex, this system remains trustworthy.